Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Seraphim Live webinar. Today we're here to discuss the Seraphim SpaceTech ecosystem map for 2024. I'd like to welcome to the stream today, we've got Seraphim investors, Dr. Maureen Haverty. Hi Maureen.
Hi Leah, hi everyone.
And Lucas Bishop, who are both on the investment team at Seraphim Space. The map represents the most exciting VC-funded space tech startups globally, comprising over 300 companies from 30 different countries. The data was collated from our individual analysis, looking at companies that are servicing all segments, including build, launch, collect, analyze, and product markets. We'll run this webinar today in a Q&A style fashion with the investors, but we're doing this live to allow you, the audience, to ask any questions you have to the investors directly. So let's begin. The map we're going to be putting up on the screen as and when, but it's actually been published today on our website and also on our social media. So if you want to have a little look while we're going through, hopefully it'll help you formulate some really interesting questions. So Maureen, I'll go to you first. Could you explain just the purpose of the ecosystem map to everyone and why we all choose to put this together at Seraphim?
So first of all, it's to give an overview of the different sectors that exist within the space sector. So covering, hardware, the building of hardware for satellites, the launches, constellations or platforms, and then everything to get it down back to Earth, and then people building products around it. So it's to give an overview of the sector and how we think of the different sectors, and then who are the key players in that sector. And the idea being is that you can kind of get an overview, you can see quickly what the competitive landscape might be. So we use it, other investors use it, but also we hope that startups themselves will use it to see how investors might be thinking about the competitive landscape as well.
Awesome, thank you. So if you find yourself tagged in it, please share it on social media, because I think we've already had a lot of interest in that today. Lucas, can you explain to everyone how you collect the data? What data analysis do you use?
Yeah, so we're in quite a fortunate position as a space-dedicated venture fund that, I guess, for the purposes of our own deal flow, we often have space tech startups come to us. The whole team has, our own respective networks that are deep in different areas of the space ecosystem. So as a result of our deal flow and our day-to-day work, we see an awful lot of what's happening in space, and we kind of take a view on what our most exciting businesses are. For the purposes of this map, pulling it together and deciding which companies actually go on there is in part, which of the businesses within the space economy are the best funded, and then there's also a bit of a subjective angle around which ones we think are most exciting. Really, I mean, we go through our deal flow, we go through our space index to see who's been raising recently. We use, private equity databases to figure out the exact amount of funding that different companies have raised. And then we, use the metrics and use our own subjective view to come to a decision on what we think best represents, everything that's most exciting within each of those buckets within space tech.
I think just one thing to add to that is there's a lot of internal debate. So when Lucas mentions that this is our subjective view, there's definitely a lot of internal debate, and sometimes we miss companies. We miss companies that ended up having a great year, or we include companies that ended up having a terrible year and sometimes go out of business. So it's quite subjective, based a lot on the insights that we have on the industry.
And one other thing I'd even add to that, it's not just the companies that we assess. We also sort of continually update our thinking on, are these the right buckets by which we should be kind of dividing the space economy? I think from 2022 to 2023, we had a bit of a reshuffle, and there were a lot of businesses kind of appearing to kind of provide different software, both in space and for manufacturing businesses. So we kind of rejigged to demonstrate that. There were a lot of very climate-focused businesses in the downstream that were appearing. So, it's not just the companies. We also kind of use the map to sort of show where our thinking is on the space economy, not just companies, but the whole landscape more broadly.
Great, that's really interesting. Thanks, guys. So if you're listening and you're missed, let us know and tell us why you think you should be on the map. Maureen, this year you have identified 6 areas that are currently experiencing growth. Can you touch upon where investment is focused in these particular areas, where you've seen the most?
So I think one of the things that we looked at is, of our overall larger segments. So if you look at the map, we have launch, we have platforms, we have, product. We identified who the top funded players were in those segments. I think maybe that might be, possibly that's what you're referring to. So just, in launch and platforms, in both segments, SpaceX is obviously by far the largest, best funded company in that. It's the top funded company overall in the space sector. One thing I think that's kind of interesting is that in general, we try really hard, even though space companies might be operating in a number of different sectors, we try really hard to bucket them into one sector where, that's their key role, or they're the top player there. With SpaceX is one where we have to include SpaceX in both sectors, because you might have someone who doesn't know the space sector and not realize that SpaceX is actually by far the leading player in platforms and communications. So SpaceX tends to be an exception. In the in-space economy, we've got Sierra Space. Sierra Space, who were a spin out from Sierra Nevada a couple of years ago. They've raised a huge amount of funding, I think over $1 billion in funding, 1.7 billion actually. In product, I think is something that people are often surprised that we look at as space investors, but they're people who use space data or space data to build a product around that, to provide products to consumers or to businesses often without having anything in space themselves. And we think that, and that's the top funded there is Mapbox. In downlink, it's Kymeta, so they make ground terminals. In build, it's Ursa Major, who make engines for all the new rocket launch companies. And in analyze, I think this is an interesting one, it's Orbital Insight. So Orbital Insight is it's a top funded company in analyze, but it was acquired by Privateer this year. So I think analyze has had maybe potentially a kind of a challenging year.
Awesome, thank you. Lucas, what about trends? Have you noticed any trends in the different sectors that you want to express?
Yeah. So when you look across the map, it's clear that different areas, in launch and the constellation segment, the companies there are all significantly very well funded. I don't think there are many companies there listed that have raised any less than 10 million plus, and that's not the case all over the map. So if you look at software for satellites or software to support the space industrial base, these companies are much earlier stage. They've raised a lot less money. So depending on where you're looking, you see different trends in investment. The launch segment and the satellite constellation segment, as we've kind of seen through the space index, has been very well funded historically. It was pretty much the 2 largest areas of investment all the way up to 2022. For this revision of the ecosystem map, we've actually haven't seen too many changes, and I think that's partly in line with the kind of reduction in investment that we've seen into that segment. There's just been, there's a fair number of established players. It's more difficult for new entrants now that you have these established players. So relatively few changes there. I think where there's a little bit more activity is, surrounding aspects of the space, kind of manufacturing and industrial base. Few changes there, few new companies. The in-space economy continues to evolve. We just saw True Anomaly raise a 100 million round for kind of space defense, which is a new and kind of emerging area that people wouldn't have thought of even just 5 years ago. So launch and collect, relatively stable, and I think other areas like the in-space economy and kind of the manufacturing base are a little bit more dynamic.
Great, thank you. If anyone's got any questions, keep them coming in and the team will pick them up at the end. Maureen, in the top 10 funded companies, I think this includes a lot of US companies. You've already mentioned SpaceX. Is this something that you expect? Is this something you think will continue over the next few years? How will this play out?
Basically, yes, it's definitely something we expect. So first of all, just so everyone knows, we don't include Chinese startups in our ecosystem map. The key reason for that is that in the space sector, because it's highly defense related or it's critical technology related, and for geopolitical reasons, foreign investment to Chinese space startups is essentially closed. And since this is meant to be a tool looking at VC funded startups and who's available to invest in, that's why we choose to not include Chinese startups. And they actually are a key player. There are a lot of well-funded startups there within that ecosystem. But so if they're excluded, definitely the US is going to be by far the largest. It will be by far the largest anyway. Couple of reasons for that. It has by far the largest space sector. The US government is one of the largest customers for space. It has the largest growth capital investment in infrastructure and ecosystem. And that means that if you want to raise a huge amount of money, that means you've gotten to the growth capital stage, and you're certainly raising from US investors, if not are actually based in the US, and you tend to be more likely to be based in the US. There's a home bias. And then also, I think something that is probably a little bit underappreciated is that because the US space ecosystem and startup ecosystem is the strongest and the largest, you're selling into that ecosystem. If you're a company, selling satellites, if you're a launch company, the growing space sector, the growing startup ecosystem actually help grows your business. You might have a customer that flies one tech demo with you or buys one piece of demo hardware, but actually they go on to be a really successful startup. And if you have a couple of those, suddenly you're a successful business. And that doesn't exist yet really in Europe. I think there are much more tech demo missions or smaller startups that have not yet grown and grown their suppliers with them.
Thanks, Maureen. We just had a question in, just someone wants a little bit more information on the Chinese companies. Do you have any insight of how much of the market the Chinese market may have captured? I mean, rough idea.
In terms of funding, do you know that off the top of your head, Lucas?
No, yeah, I know there've been really massive rounds, in the hundreds of millions for land space, which I think is a rocket launcher business. I forget the other constellations, but yeah, very massive rounds, but yeah, couldn't quantify it that reliably.
Great, thanks, guys. So the map's obviously showing, that the VC investment into SpaceTech has remained robust, which is great news. What confidence does this data, you think, Lucas, bring to other investors looking to invest in the sector, perhaps ones that are perhaps not used to investing in the SpaceTech sector?
Yes, from the index, we saw that while the beginning of the year, beginning of 2023 struggled with investment, the end of the year actually pulled back, and 2023 investment was pretty much in line with 2022. I think in terms of the so it kind of indicates that there's a returning confidence, particularly in the later stage companies, later stage space tech companies, and we kind of saw the return of growth rounds with businesses coming back to market there. I think in terms of the map, it's interesting that these days we're able to represent 350 companies within the map, the majority of which you've raised tens of millions of dollars from VCs, and these all of these companies are really quite global. If you go back to our Seraphim's much earlier ecosystem maps, I think they go back as far as 2017. They were much smaller, much more sparsely populated. Pretty much all of the businesses represented on there were much earlier stage, much more speculative startups at the time. And now we've got some pretty well established businesses, companies like Rocket Lab, obviously SpaceX, and Planet Labs, all listed on the map, that were being venture funded at the time that Seraphim was started, but these days are pretty well established companies. So I think it's interesting to look at the map over time and see how it's evolved, and we're representing more companies than ever. They've pretty much raised more funding than they have at any point in history before today. And we're seeing, new domains evolve, like the in-space economy. So I think looking at how the ecosystem map has evolved over the last few years is quite interesting, and shows the progress that the space economy has been making over the last few years.
And just to add to that as well, I think in some ways what's interesting and might give investors and just people who are generally interested in the space economy confidence is the map does not change massively year to year. I think the change from last year to this year was not enormous. And what does that reflect? It reflects that not many companies have gone out of business, which was, I think, when the market turned, there were a lot of doomsday blogs about it's all a house of cards, it's all going to come tumbling down, one big well-funded startup goes under and it's all going to go under. And that definitely has not happened. We've had very few companies leave because they've gone out of business. So I think that's an area to be confident in. And, even though there's not much change, year to year, in some ways the requirements to get onto the map are more stringent. To be in launch, you probably have to raise tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. We thoughtfully include extra sectors where much less funding might be required, but it's not at this point, the businesses that are on there are all credible businesses, and seem to have some staying power and have probably raised several rounds of funding, as Lucas said. So I think a lot to be confident in based on the map.
Yes, that's great to hear. Lucas, you just mentioned it, but the in-space economy, I think, is one of the newer elements of the map over the last few years. Where is investment focused in this, and what strides will we see, do you think, from this sector in the next decade?
Yeah, I think one of the kind of the earliest areas that we're going to see, or that we are seeing emerging in the space economy, really is in the infrastructure. So, and this is largely driven by the deorbiting of the ISS, the fact that the West needs to maintain a presence in LEO for R&D, for soft diplomacy, for a number of reasons. So, Axiom's been very well funded. They've received hundreds of millions of dollars from investors. And through NASA's commercial LEO contracts. Similar case for Voyager. So I think really the first area of the in-space economy that we're seeing develop has been in-space infrastructure. I think that's the most well-funded area there. Beyond that, I think we'll see, the development of in-space services coming. Companies like Orbit Fab, who've raised a lot of money, are actively pursuing that. But there's a number of other businesses as well. Curves Orbital, a company that came through our accelerator, is also looking to address that with a slightly different go-to-market. I think it's fair to say that the longer-term markets are, the in-space resource utilization, who knows, moon mining, asteroid mining, etc. I think it's fair to say that, we're not going to expect these to really flourish in this decade. So, longer term markets over there, but definitely in the short term, I think where we're seeing the nearest term market, and as a result, the majority of funding at the moment is really the infrastructure layer.
Thank you. Maureen, we hear the space for Earth, I think, is obviously quite an important sector. People, what with geopolitical environment, etc. How is this area? Have you seen any change in this particular area? How is this, really? Obviously, it's a hugely important sector for people in today's age. How are you seeing changes or any developments in this area?
Yeah, so I think the space for Earth sector is basically any kind of constellations that are being used for the benefit of things of people on Earth. So in general, that falls into two categories. It falls into communications constellations and Earth observation constellations in very broad strokes. So I think how have we seen these change in the current geopolitical environment? I think first of all, when VCs probably got into space in earnest, starting around 2017, I think everyone assumed that it would be a really rapid commercialization. The customers would all be commercial companies, industry, very quickly, and that would grow very rapidly. And even for the newer startups, it has remained a lot more defense focused than anticipated. there's two reasons for that. I think one, the commercial adoption has been a little slower than anticipated. There's some feeling that product needs to be developed a little bit more so that less sophisticated users of space data can access the benefits of space data as much as possible. And also, as you point out, the changing geopolitical environment means that there's a greater defense need, a greater security need than ever before. So actually governments have been pumping a lot of money into spending on Earth observation. So I think that they're the changes or lack of changes, or how we've seen things develop there. And I think there are startup companies have done very well because the US government in particular has really focused on buying from companies rather than doing it in-house. So one of our portfolio companies, iSize, big seller, there's Black Sky, Planet. There's a lot of companies, another portfolio company, Pixel, who have who've come on the big and new Earth observation contracts that the NRO, NGA, etc., have put out. So I think that's where Earth observation has happened. I think with communications, I think it's really interesting. I think probably even the most optimistic SpaceX observer did not really believe they would have so many satellites in orbit right now. They didn't believe that Starlink would be quite as successful as it is, especially by now. And certainly that, it seems like Starlink became profitable last year. So all of that, I think that's been an interesting development. I think OneWeb has had greater challenges, with OneWeb initially going bankrupt, but obviously it has survived and merged with Eutelsat. So there is that communications piece there. And then someone that doesn't feature as much in the map because they're self-funded are the Amazon Kuiper constellation that's just about to launch. So I think broadband communications is definitely forming into a few really strong, sophisticated players. And then we see a lot still of IoT companies, but again, that market maybe has not taken off quite as much as possible as thought as possible. And you might have seen that we recently made an investment into Skylo, who are a company that leverages existing geostationary satellites to provide direct to cell. And we think direct to cell is an increasingly important sector. SpaceX is pursuing it, Skylo is pursuing it, Apple is pursuing it. So I think all of that is an interesting sector to watch.
Great, thanks. Any surprises for either of you, by either positive or negative, when you were doing the research this year? Anyone?
Maureen, you go ahead.
Yeah. I feel like, oh no, I'm never surprised. I'm knee deep in the industry. I think basically, even though when we look back, we did our space index during the year. We felt the received wisdom would be that capital intensive businesses are not raising money because of the high interest rate environment, and that's definitely true. It is very challenging, but because they are later stage, but because they do have higher capital needs, because they do have investors who want to help support them to grow, actually it was launch companies and I think constellations who raised the most who raised the most in 2023. And I think if you look at the top 10 best funded companies, they're launch companies of all time. They're launch companies and they're constellation companies. Whereas I think maybe some of the more software focused, product focused companies can, take a step back from fundraising and just go on and make money earlier. So I think it's interesting to see how our assumptions around the interest rate environment actually play out in practice with companies and their needs for fundraising.
Great, thanks. And Lucas, how does the research that you do provide real value to you as an investor?
Yeah, so I mean, it's important for us to have a very full understanding of the space tech landscape and all the companies that are out there. We want to obviously be selecting what we view as the category leaders in each segment, but it's equally important for us to be very aware of the competitors and aware of the areas of the space economy where we haven't placed a bet that we think would be interesting candidates. So, for completing the map is kind of a result of, the analysis that we do on a day-to-day basis. It's a good exercise to go and sit down among the team and have that discussion about how we put together the map and what we represent there. And it just represents the way we're thinking about our own investment strategy, what we're looking at, and where there might be interesting areas in the market.
And I think, just as a concrete example, last year I think we felt the need to put in this new in-space economy sector. We noticed a lot of very interesting companies, and we made an effort to try and meet with the vast majority of those companies over the year to see whether, is this a sector that we want to invest in, and if so, who do we want to invest in? So that was something that we used it for last year.
Yeah, and how do you think this benefits the community? I think you met as well as founders and other VCs, and why do you take the time to put this together and release it so everyone can use the tool themselves?
Yeah, so we're space specialist investors, so often we have generalist and maybe deep tech investors that contact us and say, okay, I'm looking at this company. I'm looking at this company in this sector. What do I need to know about this sector? Who are the competitors here? Especially maybe if they're local investors, so they're investing in Europe, and they're like, I can't find any competitors really in Europe. I'm like, well, actually, there's this big competitor in the US or in Australia, and you really need to take a look at them to decide whether or not you want to invest in this company or not. So it's hoping to translate some of those kind of insights to provide to other investors, so they can see, okay, actually, really quickly, there are lots of competitors in this space. And not that I'm not going to invest in this, like lots of competitors might mean that it's a huge market, but I probably need to start talking to them, start talking to their investors to see if I found the right company. I think that's one way that investors use it.
That's great. And what sectors, Lucas, at the moment are a priority for Seraphim? Where are you particularly focusing your energy?
Yeah, so we've got a pretty nice portfolio of satellite constellations at the moment. I think what would be interesting is, and what we continue to look for is new businesses that leverage all of these new data streams. We've got higher resolution, higher revisits than ever before. So businesses that build this new data into, say, insurance products, now that we have higher resolution to be able to detect, faults, movements, etc. Businesses that improve weather predictions, businesses that are able to produce higher accuracy carbon credits as a result of using all of these new data streams. I think that's very exciting. It's very close to the very end market, so I think it's a good place to capture value. Personally, I really like the kind of manufacturing and industrial base, so I'm keeping an eye on that segment as well. I think a few themes that are going to be very important kind of going forward. Climate is obviously one, and space plays a very big role in climate. And there's a number of different areas where space intersects with climate, but it's largely in the satellite constellations and those downstream businesses that are building applications for climate. And also defense crosses over very heavily with space, and it's quite a hot market for investment at the moment, but there's a lot of touch points, whether that's in satcoms, whether that's in intelligence, in EO. I think there's a lot of areas where defense crosses over with space, and it's been brought to the forefront as an important area for investment as a result of Ukraine and other geopolitical issues. So hopefully that's a bit of a flavor of a few themes and areas that we're looking at the moment.
And Maureen, anything that particularly exciting you? Where will you be looking?
I think, just like Lucas said, I'm particularly interested in defense. I think that for companies that are pursuing the defense market, actually it's unfortunately for the world, like great for the companies, they can kind of get market adoption quite quickly, because I think that governments have become less conservative about using new technology and working with new partners, because the needs are so pressing. And I think that companies can have a really big positive impact as well. So I find that very interesting.
That's great. I think over previous years, kind of defense tech companies have been kind of underinvested in and misunderstood, haven't they? I think by a lot of VCs. I think people have not been so keen to get involved. So I think that's great that these things are changing and people are understanding that more. We'll take a couple of questions, and if anyone's got any questions, please post them in the chat and we can pick them up. We've got a few minutes left. Maureen, someone's asked a question about, sorry, I can't remember if it was Lucas or Maureen who answered this one, but about space mining. You say it may not flourish in the next decade, but how do you anticipate that investors will be interested in investing in the near term?
I think it was Lucas who answered it, but I'll just think, will they invest, soon? I think it's a really challenging one. I think, and again, it comes back to interest rates. So I mentioned that, like, look, if you've large capital needs, you're still going to get the money. That's not quite true. I think what we're seeing is if you've large capital needs, you need to have near-term revenues, or you need to have revenues right now if you want support from growth investors. And if you don't, and if you're something like in space mining, you almost certainly don't, I think that's going to be really challenging to raise from growth investors. Having said that, if you're in space mining, you're probably pretty early stage, but your capital needs are probably still quite large. And your timeline to when you can promise investors who are thinking about this more and more is like, how long will it be before you can get to revenue? I think that's a really hard story to sell at the moment. So I think a lot of companies have found that very challenging.
Great. We've got a question about, quite a long question, about AI and humanoid bots. Is this something that you know anything about? Or is it very futuristic?
First of all, haven't seen any companies doing that, but potentially would be interested in seeing them. I think probably the near-term application there might be related to, as in navigation and things like that. And actually, we have a portfolio company already who called Opteran, who mimic the way insects navigate. It's called neuromorphic modeling. They mimic the way insects navigate in space. Insects have tiny brains, but they can navigate extremely effectively in space, and they use that to do autonomous navigation in low light conditions, so drones inside factories and things like that. So we're certainly open to some fairly out there ideas, but we'd love to see some near-term applications, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Opteran, a fascinating company who came through our accelerator a couple of years ago, I think. We'll take one or two more questions. There seems to be coming in now, but running out of time. What about SSA, monitoring of space debris and space sustainability? Obviously, hugely important. Have you seen anything interesting in this sector?
I mean, I can just say that space situational awareness is kind of important to a lot of our portfolio. We're very exposed to the space ecosystem, so it's important to safeguard the orbital environment. We're already invested in a couple of businesses here. So from the ground segment, we're invested in Leo Labs. They have a global array of radars that track space debris. And then we're also invested in Privateer, a business that's looking to launch a constellation, again, to track much finer and smaller objects in space. I think there are other aspects of space situational awareness, like space weather and others. But so far we're in Leo Labs and Privateer.
I also think there's one question that's quite interesting on green funds in the space sector. So what are your thoughts from Miriam? What are your thoughts on green funds in the space sector? Not necessarily interested in space, but investing for green technologies. So we're really interested in co-investing with climate-focused investors who might be interested in using in space companies that are providing climate services or sustainability services. So for example, in our portfolio, we've got Taranis, who do precision agriculture using space and drone data. And that obviously has massive climate and resiliency implications. I think climate investors would be highly interested in a company like that. or there's tomorrow.io, who provide improved weather forecasting and then precise updates on weather and insights specifically related to your business. So we think there's lots of applications there, and we actually love co-investing with those investors, because best way to not embarrass yourself as investors to admit what you don't know or where you may have less experience. And by co-investing with climate investors, they might be like, I know exactly how precision agriculture is going to be adopted or not adopted, who's adopted, and who, and you know, it's really all about trying to leverage the expertise of other investors to achieve the best return for our shareholders.
Fantastic. And one more question. What's your take on edge computing for satellites and AI in space?
So I think it's quite important. I think a lot of companies are looking at this now, or talking about looking at that now. So the benefit of edge computing for satellites and AI in space would be that you would process your satellite data in space and maybe only send back insights or minimal data down to space. And that's really important because it takes a long time to get data back down from space to Earth. And that long time, that latency, makes the data less useful to the customers that get it, particularly in defense applications. They want the information as fast as possible, so it's as real time as possible. So I think I'm very, very interested in the potential there.
Brilliant. Thank you. I think we've run out of time, but thank you for everyone who listened. Thank you for all of your questions, and anything else on the map, please post them in the chat or on our social media page, and the team can come back and answer them for you. You'll find the map all over our socials, on our website. So I hope you all get some great use cases out of that. Thank you. And thanks, Lucas and Maureen.
Thanks.
Cheers. Bye.
Thanks, guys.